always thought it was a system file which needed to be created a snapshot of, so it backed up the file. Else we wouldn't have actually seen this file, because what we found was, obviously this slide just shows you that if you were to go into your system volume information and double click on it, it's not going to let you do that. It's going to say access denied. But when we created a forensically sound image using a tool like Encase, you can pretty much go to any directory, and this is the exact directory we went to. Now, being named a .ini file, the file was being backed up, and to our surprise, we actually found about 25 instances of this file in the system restore points. So that kind of told us this had been going on for a while. The hackers had been on the system, had got their keystroke log captures going for a while. These 25 files were about 400 pages of keystroke logs in there. And I'll get into a little more details as to how these keystroke logs were being generated. It was a pretty interesting scenario. So going to how the exploit occurred, we were still scratching our heads, trying to figure out what happened. And believe it or not, this is probably the first time in the careers of everyone at my organization that Dr. Watson helped us. Dr. Watson helped us. Can you believe that? What we found in Dr. Watson was an access violation, and for those of you in the Unix world, that's more like a segmentation fault in your world. So we saw an access violation in the Dr. Watson logs. What we also found was that the file was last written to on the 27th of May at about 8:47 a.m., which was around the time frame when the lady observed that her credentials were gone. Of some help for a change. We also, like I said, an access violation is just like a segmentation fault. We looked at the user.dump, which corresponds to the Dr. Watson logs and actually dumps memory at that point. What we found in there was a mail server, a web-based email server, was being accessed at the time of this access violation, and that's what the user dump recorded. It was this particular web-based email site. So now we kind of had a clue as to there was some hanky-panky related to this web-based email site. We looked around the system, tried to identify if there were any potential Trojans, could not identify anything. The only clues that we found on the system were the sds.ini.ini files, like I said, about 25 instances of that. So the next step basically for us was to create a VMware session and to actually go to this website to see what got downloaded on our systems. Obviously we were running tools like Regmon, FileMon, and some other analysis tools. To our surprise, what we found was that the web page itself had been infected. It had an iframe on it of 0 height. Does anyone know what an iframe is? Any web developers, HTML kind of guys here? iframe? Beg your pardon? Yeah, it's an inline frame. So an iframe is an inline frame. What we found was, looking up the source code of the page, it had a 0 height inline frame. What that meant was the inline frame was not going to show up when you actually went to this site. But what it did was, it pointed you to a malicious website where there was this malicious executable sitting that got downloaded on your system. And if your Internet Explorer was vulnerable to that particular vulnerability that it tried to exploit, it would exploit it and do certain bad things, which, again, when we started performing a black box analysis, and the reason we did black box and not a whole analysis, it was AS Packard executable, and given the time constraints imposed on us during this investigation, we thought we'd get the best bang for our buck by performing a black box analysis. We performed a black box analysis. We got a fair understanding of what this executable was doing. It was definitely capturing keystrokes, we knew that, but what it was doing was capturing keystrokes specific to financial institutions only. So if I entered keystrokes and actually Messenger, those were the two things it was going after. I don't know why they were going after Messenger, but they were going after that. So there were targeted keystrokes being logged. It was actually removing its executable components periodically. It was removing anything that it created in the registry in Slack space. But again, in AS Packard, it wasn't of much help to see certain fragments, that too Packard fragments in Slack space. So we thought at this point, maybe we've understood only 10%, but we kind of knew who the culprit was for this attack. It was this website, and this lady did have an email account on this website. So she went to this website, downloaded this executable unknowingly, it executed on her machine, captured keystrokes, and actually what I forgot to mention, it had a built-in SMTP server that periodically sent out her keystroke logs to a mail server outside of the United States. So pretty neat little utility. I wish I could hand it out to you guys to play around with. And just thought, before I move on from this case, just throw some light on what a popular antivirus vendor had to say. A popular antivirus vendor actually classified this as the multi-dropper Trojan. If you look at the risk rating there, it's pretty interesting. It said for end users or corporate users, it's a low risk rating. I don't see how a Trojan that could potentially steal thousands of dollars from someone's account could be a low risk Trojan, but that was what was assigned to it. So the point I was trying to put across with this is antivirus is not a panacea. It's not a cure-all. We have to look beyond antivirus. We have to be more aware of what's going on out there and different ways attackers are using to exploit end users. So actually, before I move on to the next case study, which also talks about end user attacks, but in a very different arena, I thought I'd open this up to a little bit of discussion. Of late, there's been, like I said, a big finger-pointing game, and the banks seem to be saying, we're doing our part. End users say, you cannot expect me to know that stuff. I just thought I'd get an opinion. Who thinks this is the fault of financial institutions? Just raise your hand. One hand goes up there. One more, one more, one more. Seems like a worm. One more. Just 5 people. Who thinks this is the fault of the end user? One hand, 5. So the others think that it's no one's fault. I didn't want to say it, you said it. Yeah, so others are, it's the vendor's fault. And I guess everyone is right in a certain way. It being the vendor's fault, you can do little about it other than not use that particular software. But how do you educate users like, and I won't be sexist here. A lot of people say, oh, my mom's on the internet, or grandmama, and try to explain to them, hey, you need to download Mozilla, Thunderbird, or something else. It's kind of imagining the magnitude. I think banks definitely need to take the initiative, as they're the ones who understand the threats more than these kind of end users, not you guys, but more my granddad type of end users. They need to kind of point end users to facts about what unpatched browsers can do, how dangerous they can be, things of that nature. There needs to be more awareness coming from their front. And actually, what I've been seeing, at least some of the financial institutions that I've worked with in the United States, they are taking some pretty good measures. For example, E-Trade now hands out RSA Secure ID tokens to anyone who has more than $50,000 in their brokerage account. But that's for free. If you don't have that kind of amount, which a lot of people don't have, including myself, you got to pay $25 for that, which I think is a fair trade-off. If you educate the user, charge them $25 for security, I think it's quite worth it. There's some other two-factor authentication kind of solutions out there. Now hands out RSA Secure ID tokens to anyone who has more than $50,000 in their brokerage account. But that's for free. If you don't have that kind of amount, which a lot of people don't have, including myself, you got to pay $25 for that, which I think is a fair trade-off. If you educate the user, charge them $25 for security, I think it's quite worth it. There's some other two-factor authentication kind of solutions out there which banks are incorporating. Recently also I saw that ING in the US has they need, because then the keystroke lock in this case would just be MC, 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 and you really won't have the PIN in there. So I think there are, the role is being played by financial institutions, and also end users need to play their roles. Is there a question? No. So I'll just move on to the next case so I can keep up to my 58-minute promise. This was another case I dealt with in the recent past, and it was an interesting one. Basically, we walk into an incident pretty much like a doctor in his office when a patient comes in and they just pretty much say, I have a stomach ache. You got to figure out if it's stomach cancer or it's just a minor infection. What we saw here was 20 minutes before the opening bell on a Monday, an investment bank had 172 traders locked out of the network. Basically, they could not log on to the network. Now that means a hell of a lot for investment banks. 172 traders locked out at the time of the opening bell is potentially tens of thousands of dollars for every minute that they cannot trade. The first time it happened, the administrator thought it was coincidence. It was some sort of maintenance procedure that took place on Friday that caused this problem, and pretty much reset manually those 172 accounts. The incident occurred 2 weeks later. At this point, they did realize it's a potential security breach and rightly called in, I guess, incident responders. Being brought into this, I kind of, the first place I start off with is the network, and I said, you know, if you have any network logs, unfortunately in this case, they did have net flow there, so network logs did exist. I started looking at the network logs, and again, all I had in mind was the target date and time as clue. So I sorted those network logs and started looking at the 21st of February 2005 to figure out, did anything suspicious happen? Now, if you look at the yellow line that I have highlighted there, do you see something strange there? SMB traffic. A lot of SMB traffic. If you look at the destination port there, it's 445. And also in speaking to the administrators, we figured out that the 192.168.2.8 was the domain controller. So we see a lot of SMB packets going to the domain controller. Hint, hint. Well, 192.168.2.4 looked like a rogue machine to us. So we said, why not home in on this machine? So we began to home in on the 2.4 machine, just looking at, unfortunately we came into this situation while the attack was still active. So we had a lot of volatile data that we could capture as well. This is not volatile data, but I'll go through that as well. Just basic directory listings showed us that there were some pretty interesting tools there. PSExec, what's PSExec do? Basically allows you to remotely execute commands if you have administrative privileges on a machine. And there's a couple of other NetBIOS hacking related like NBT enum and NetPass password brute forcing kind of tools on there. You see the timestamp on NBT enum and NetPass. It was around on the 21st of February 05 at 9:11 a.m. And the timestamp on NBT enum and NetPass, it was around on the 21st of February 05 at 9:11 a.m. server. So started wondering, why is an end user workstation dual homed? It had a wireless connection on it, which had a 10.1 address, and it had its regular 192 address on the wired network. Again, I spoke to the administrator and said, you didn't tell me about your wireless network here. He said, we have none. So I started thinking, there is no wireless network, but there still is a wireless network. The active open connections, again, we saw some NetBIOS connection open to 10.103, which, like you saw in the previous slide, is that particular machine which is actually initiating some sort of weird activity against the domain controller. So there was this machine from 10.105. Now, there was no wireless network. There's a couple of machines on the wireless networks. Things were still a bit fuzzy. We started looking at the active processes, and like I pointed out, we'd found the executable, but we also found an active PSExec service running on the machine when we actually looked at the active processes. So it was kind of becoming a little clear. It seemed like there was a NetBIOS attack which had been successful against this dual-homed machine, which was then being used by as a base by the attacker to actually go after the domain controller. But how did the attacker get to this machine? Well, we looked at the wireless network configuration on this machine, and that seemed like the culprit there. Can anyone tell me what the problem is there? Did you hear something? Yeah, it pretty much says connect to any wireless network, and when that's said that way, it basically says the wireless network with the highest strength, that's the one you want to connect to, the one with the highest signal strength. Not the best setting, definitely not a recommended setting, but that's how this machine was configured. So now it seemed like this machine was connecting to some sort of a rogue wireless network out there which had a pretty high strength, because otherwise it wouldn't connect to it. It was connecting to that, and potentially some other machine on that wireless network was routing to this. Pretty interesting, the first time I saw an attack of that nature. So our next goal was to locate this rogue access point. Now again, it's pretty easy to locate a rogue access point if you're somewhere in the middle of Colorado or Maine or someplace like that in the US or in farm country.